France, 1916. Part 1. A Mother's Blessing. In the quiet village of Sainte-Marie, nestled within the rolling hills of the French countryside, life was both simple and harsh. The year was 1916, and the Great War had cast its long shadow over Europe, reaching even this remote corner of the world. The once bustling village square was now subdued, with the faces of loved ones left behind filled with anxiety as they awaited news from the front. Louis Dupont, a young man of 20, had grown up in this village, surrounded by the fields his family had tilled for generations. His life had been one of hard work, faith, and a deep connection to the land and its people. Louis was not a soldier by nature. He had always been more comfortable with a plow than a rifle. But when the call to serve came, he knew it was his duty to protect his home and family. The day before his departure, Louis's mother, Marie, called him into the small, rustic kitchen of their farmhouse. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, a scent that always reminded Louis of comfort and home. Marie, her face lined with worry, handed him a small crucifix, worn smooth from years of use. "This has been in our family for generations, Louis," she said, her voice trembling. "It has protected your father, your grandfather, and now it will protect you. Keep it close to your heart and remember that God is always with you." Louis took the crucifix, feeling the weight of the generations of faith it represented. He knew how much it meant to his mother, and he promised to carry it with him always. As they embraced, Marie whispered a prayer for his safe return, her tears soaking into his uniform. Louis held her tightly, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that his faith would be his anchor. The next morning, Louis joined the other young men from the village at the train station. The once lively platform was now a place of somber farewells, as families bid their sons, brothers, and husbands goodbye. The train, a hulking iron beast, puffed black smoke into the cold morning air as it prepared to take these men to the front lines. Louis looked around at his comrades, seeing the same mix of fear and resolve in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. As the train rumbled to life, Louis took one last look at the village he had called home for so long. The fields, now covered in frost, the church steeple rising against the gray sky, and the people he loved all seemed to blur together as the train pulled away. He clutched the crucifix in his hand, silently praying for the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The journey to the front was long and arduous, the train clattering through the French countryside that gradually changed from the familiar green pastures of home to the scarred, barren lands closer to the war. The soldiers spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. Louis found solace in his prayers, whispering them as the train passed through desolate villages and towns, each one bearing the marks of war. When they finally arrived at the front, the reality of war hit Louis with full force. The trenches were a nightmare. Muddy, rat-infested ditches that stretched for miles, filled with the stench of death and decay. The sounds of artillery fire and the cries of the wounded were constant reminders of the danger that surrounded them. Louis's heart sank as he looked around, feeling the overwhelming fear that came with the knowledge that his life could end at any moment. Yet, in the midst of this horror, Louis's faith remained his guiding light. Each night, as the other soldiers tried to find some comfort in sleep, Louis would kneel in the mud, the crucifix clutched tightly in his hands, and pray. He prayed for his mother, for his village, and for the strength to survive this nightmare. He prayed for his comrades, many of whom had already fallen, and for the end of this terrible war. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Louis's faith was tested in ways he could never have imagined. The horrors he witnessed, the endless shelling, the sight of his friends being cut down by machine gun fire, the sheer brutality of the war, began to take their toll. Doubt crept into his heart, and he found himself questioning the very existence of the God he had always believed in. How could a loving God allow such suffering? Why was there so much death, so much pain? These questions haunted Louis, even as he continued to pray. He knew that he had to hold on to his faith, that it was the only thing keeping him from succumbing to the despair that surrounded him. But the burden of doubt was heavy, and he struggled to find the answers he so desperately needed. One evening, as he knelt in the trench, his prayers filled with anguish, Lewis felt a presence beside him. He opened his eyes and saw a faint light, flickering in the darkness. It was not a physical light, but something deeper, something that seemed to come from within him. The light grew brighter, and for the first time in weeks, Lewis felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew then that he was not alone. God had not abandoned him, even in this hellish place. The light was a reminder that faith was not about understanding everything, but about trusting in something greater than himself. Lewis's doubts began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that he had to survive, not just for himself, but for his family, for his comrades, and for the God who had always been with him. As the night wore on, Lewis continued to pray, his heart filled with a newfound strength. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. He was a soldier, but more than that, he was a man of faith, and that faith would carry him through the darkest days of the war. Part 2. The Trenches of Despair. Lewis had been at the front for several weeks now, and the initial shock of war had settled into a grim routine. The Battle of the Somme was in full swing, and every day brought new horrors. The trenches, which had once seemed like a temporary means of defense, had become a nightmarish labyrinth of mud, decay, and death. The soldiers lived like animals, burrowing into the earth to escape the relentless artillery barrages that shook the ground and shattered the sky. Lewis had grown accustomed to the constant dampness that seeped into his bones, the stench of rotting bodies that lingered in the air, and the sight of his comrades, once full of life and hope, now reduced to lifeless forms in the mud. The war had stripped away the humanity from everything it touched, leaving behind a wasteland devoid of color, warmth, or comfort. Despite the overwhelming despair that hung over the trenches, Lewis held onto his faith. Each night, as he huddled in the cramped dugout with the other soldiers, he would clutch the crucifix his mother had given him and whisper prayers for strength, for protection, for the war to end. His comrades, many of whom had lost their faith long ago, would watch him with a mixture of pity and admiration. They didn't understand how he could still believe in a God that allowed such suffering, but they respected his unwavering devotion. One particularly cold and miserable night, Lewis was on guard duty. The wind howled through the trenches, carrying with it the scent of smoke and gunpowder. The ground was slick with mud, making it difficult to move without slipping. As he stood there, rifle in hand, his breath visible in the frigid air, Lewis thought of home. He thought of the warmth of his mother's kitchen, the sound of the church bells ringing on Sunday mornings, and the peaceful fields of St. Marie. The memories brought a brief flicker of warmth to his heart, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold reality of his situation. Suddenly, a flare shot up into the sky, casting an eerie light over the battlefield. Lewis tensed, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of shouts and gunfire. The enemy was close. Lewis's grip tightened on his rifle as he prepared for the worst. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds of battle grew louder, and Lewis could see the silhouettes of enemy soldiers advancing through the fog. His instincts kicked in, and he raised his rifle, aiming at the shadowy figures. But before he could pull the trigger, a blinding light filled his vision. It wasn't the harsh, artificial light of a flare, but something softer, more ethereal. Lewis blinked in confusion, wondering if he was seeing things, if the stress of war had finally driven him mad. But the light didn't fade. It grew brighter, enveloping him in a warm, comforting glow. For a moment, the sounds of war disappeared, replaced by a deep, all-encompassing silence. Lewis felt a presence beside him, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in months. It was as if time had stopped, and he was no longer in the trenches, but in a place far beyond the reach of war. In that moment, Lewis felt a deep conviction settle in his heart. He knew that he was being guided, that this light, this presence, was a sign from God. He lowered his rifle, the fear that had gripped him moments before melting away. Instead of firing at the enemy, Lewis turned and began to move through the trenches, the light guiding his steps. He passed by his fellow soldiers, who stared at him in bewilderment as he moved with purpose through the maze of mud and debris. They called out to him, asking what he was doing, but Lewis didn't respond. He couldn't explain what was happening, but he knew that he had to follow the light, that it was leading him to something important, something that would change the course of the battle. As he moved deeper into the trenches, the light grew stronger, illuminating the way forward. Lewis felt a sense of urgency, a need to reach his destination before it was too late. The sounds of battle grew fainter, and the chaos that had surrounded him moments before seemed distant, as if it were happening in another world. Finally, Lewis reached a small clearing in the trenches, a place where the ground was slightly higher, offering a better vantage point. The light hovered above him, casting its glow over the area. Lewis looked around, searching for what he was meant to find. And then he saw it. A group of soldiers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. They were cut off from the rest of the unit, trapped in a dead-end trench with no way out. Without hesitation, Lewis moved towards them. The soldiers looked up in surprise as he approached, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Follow me," Lewis said, his voice calm and steady. "We need to move now." The soldiers hesitated, unsure of what to do. But something in Lewis's demeanor, in the way he carried himself, gave them the strength to trust him. One by one, they stood up and followed him, leaving behind the safety of their makeshift shelter. Lewis led them back through the trenches, the light guiding their way. As they moved, Lewis could hear the sounds of the battle growing louder again. The enemy was closing in, and there wasn't much time. He quickened his pace, urging the soldiers to keep moving, to not look back. The light continued to lead them, showing the safest path through the chaos. Finally, they reached a section of the trench that connected with the main line, where reinforcements were stationed. Lewis could see the relief on the soldiers' faces as they realized they were safe, that they had escaped the imminent danger. They looked at Lewis with gratitude, their faith in him, and perhaps in something greater, renewed. Lewis, however, felt a mixture of relief and something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. He knew that what had just happened wasn't just luck or coincidence. It was a sign, a message that he was meant to be here, that his faith was guiding him in ways he couldn't fully understand. As he watched the soldiers reunite with their comrades, Lewis's thoughts turned to the light that had led him. It had disappeared as soon as they reached safety, leaving him with a profound sense of awe. He knew that he would carry this experience with him for the rest of his life, that it would shape his journey of faith in ways he had yet to discover. For now, though, there was still a war to fight, and Lewis knew that he had to stay strong, to continue following the path that had been set before him. As he prepared to return to his post, Lewis whispered a silent prayer of thanks, his faith stronger than ever. Part 3. A beacon in the dark. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the desolation of no man's land in its full, harrowing reality. The once fertile fields of France had been transformed into a nightmarish landscape, a wasteland where the earth itself seemed to weep from the relentless pounding of artillery. The ground was scarred and torn, a chaotic jumble of craters, barbed wire, and the remnants of what had once been trees and buildings. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the stench of death, a constant reminder of the countless lives that had been lost in this unforgiving place. Lewis and the small group of soldiers he had led to safety the night before found themselves in a precarious position. They had successfully navigated the maze of trenches, guided by the ethereal light that had appeared to Lewis, but now they faced the daunting task of crossing no man's land to reach the safety of their own lines. The enemy was close, their positions fortified just beyond the horizon, and the slightest movement could draw a hail of gunfire. Lewis scanned the desolate landscape, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear that had gripped him in the trenches returned with full force, but he knew he couldn't afford to let it control him. He had seen the light, had felt its guidance, and he knew that they were not alone in this forsaken place. The memory of the divine presence filled him with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The soldiers looked to Lewis, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. They trusted him, but the reality of crossing no man's land was a daunting one. Lewis could see the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation in their movements, but he also saw something else, a glimmer of hope, of faith that had been reignited by the miracle they had witnessed. "We have to move quickly and stay low," Lewis whispered, his voice calm and steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "Follow me, and don't stop until we reach the other side. Remember, we are not alone." With that, Lewis began to move, leading the group across the treacherous expanse. The ground beneath their feet was uneven and slick with mud, and every step was a battle to maintain balance. The air was thick with tension, every sense heightened as they listened for the telltale sounds of enemy movement. The distant rumble of artillery was a constant reminder that danger was all around them. As they moved, the landscape seemed to shift and change, the fog playing tricks on their eyes. The barbed wire that crisscrossed the field was a constant obstacle, tearing at their uniforms and flesh as they crawled through the mud. The remnants of the battlefield, the shattered pieces of artillery, the broken weapons, the tattered remains of those who had fallen, served as grim markers of the dangers that lurked all around them. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed across the battlefield, and the group froze in terror. The soldiers threw themselves to the ground, their hearts racing as they searched for the source of the gunfire. Lewis could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that panicking would only lead to disaster. "Stay down," Lewis whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. "We need to move, but we have to do it carefully. Keep your heads low and follow me." The group began to inch forward once again, their bodies pressed close to the ground as they moved through the mud and debris. The fear was palpable, but so was the determination. They knew that they had to keep moving, that stopping now would mean certain death. As they crawled forward, Lewis felt a sudden surge of energy, a warmth that spread through his body despite the cold. It was the light, the same divine presence that had guided him through the trenches, and it was with him now, urging him forward. Lewis knew that they were being protected, that their path was being guided by something greater than themselves. The group continued to move, inch by agonizing inch, across no man's land. The journey seemed endless, the ground stretching out before them in an unrelenting expanse of mud and wire. But Lewis kept his focus, his eyes fixed on the distant line of their own trenches. He could see the soldiers there, their silhouettes barely visible in the fog, and he knew that they were close. Suddenly, a flare shot up into the sky, illuminating the battlefield with a harsh, white light. The group froze once again, their breath catching in their throats as the flare hung in the air, casting long shadows across the ground. The light was blinding, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the soft rustling of the wind. Lewis's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the flare to die out. He knew that they were exposed, that the enemy could see them clearly now. But he also knew that they had to keep moving, that staying in one place would only make them more vulnerable. Finally, the flare began to descend, its light fading as it fell back to the ground. The group didn't waste a second. They scrambled to their feet, their movements quick and desperate as they made a final dash for the safety of their own lines. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, but Lewis didn't look back. He focused on the ground ahead, on the distant line of trenches that marked their salvation. The final moments of their journey were a blur of motion and sound. The group moved as one, their bodies pressed close together as they ran through the mud and debris. The gunfire was deafening, but Lewis barely heard it. All he could think about was reaching the trenches, of getting his men to safety. And then, finally, they were there. The soldiers in the trenches reached out, grabbing hold of them and pulling them to safety. Lewis collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The relief was overwhelming, a wave of emotion that left him feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. He looked up at the soldiers who had helped them, their faces a mixture of shock and admiration. They had seen what he and his group had done, had witnessed the impossible journey across no man's land. And in their eyes, Lewis saw something that filled him with hope, faith. Faith that had been reignited by the miracle they had just witnessed. As Lewis lay on the ground, his body aching from the ordeal, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that they had been guided, that the light had been with them every step of the way. And he knew that this was only the beginning, that there was still much more to be done. But for now, they were safe. They had survived no man's land, and that was a victory in itself. As he closed his eyes, Lewis whispered a silent prayer of thanks, his heart filled with gratitude for the divine guidance that had led them through the darkest of nights. Part 4. Courage in the Abyss. The night was a thick, oppressive blanket over the front lines, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape of the trenches. The distant rumble of artillery was a constant reminder of the ever-present danger that loomed over the soldiers. Lewis and his comrades had barely recovered from their harrowing journey across no man's land, but there was little time to rest. The enemy was massing for a final, decisive assault, and every man knew that the coming battle could determine the outcome of the war. The trench was a maze of mud and despair, a place where hope had long been buried beneath the weight of endless suffering. The walls were scarred by countless impacts, and the ground was littered with the detritus of war. Broken weapons, torn uniforms, and the silent remnants of those who had fought and died in this forsaken place. The soldiers moved with a quiet resignation, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They had seen too much, endured too much, to feel anything but the numb acceptance of their fate. Lewis stood at the edge of the trench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The light that had guided him through the darkest moments of the war was still with him, a faint but unwavering presence in his heart. He knew that they were not alone, that there was something greater watching over them. But the weight of his responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a beacon of hope for the men who looked to him for guidance. The air was thick with tension, every breath a struggle as the soldiers prepared for what was to come. The silence was broken only by the distant sounds of the enemy, the low murmur of voices, the clank of metal on metal, the soft shuffle of feet. Lewis could feel the fear in the air, the collective anxiety of men who knew that they were facing almost certain death. But there was something else as well, a quiet determination, a steely resolve that had been forged in the fires of countless battles. These men had faced the horrors of war and had survived. They had been tempered by the crucible of combat, and now, in this final hour, they were ready to make their last stand. Lewis turned to his men, his voice calm and steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "This is it, boys. We've been through hell and back, and now we stand on the edge of the abyss. But we are not alone. We have each other, and we have the light that guides us. Whatever happens, remember this. We fight not just for ourselves, but for those who will come after us. We fight for our families, for our homes, for the hope that this war will one day end. And we fight with faith in our hearts, knowing that God is with us." The men nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They had heard Lewis's words before, but now, on the brink of what could be their final battle, they took them to heart. There was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose, that bound them together. They were not just soldiers, they were brothers in arms, united by the unbreakable bond of those who had faced death together. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, every second dragging on as they waited for the inevitable assault. The tension was unbearable, a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. Lewis could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his pulse a rapid, insistent drumbeat that matched the distant thrum of artillery. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white as he braced himself for the coming storm. And then, without warning, the night exploded into chaos. The enemy came at them with a ferocity that took Lewis's breath away. The trench was lit up by the flash of gunfire, the deafening roar of explosions filling the air as the two sides clashed in a desperate, frenzied battle. The ground shook beneath their feet, the very earth trembling with the force of the conflict. Men screamed and shouted, their voices lost in the cacophony of war. Lewis moved through the chaos with a single-minded focus, his every thought consumed by the need to protect his men. He fired his rifle with deadly precision, every shot finding its mark as he fought to hold the line. The enemy was relentless, wave after wave crashing against the defenses in a seemingly endless tide. But Lewis and his men stood firm, their resolve unshakable as they held their ground. The battle raged on, the night a blur of noise and movement, of light and shadow. Lewis could feel the exhaustion setting in, his muscles burning with the effort of holding his rifle steady, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he pushed through the pain, drawing on the last reserves of his strength as he fought to protect his men. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the enemy's assault began to falter. Lewis could see the weariness in their movements, the hesitation in their attacks. The tide was turning, the momentum shifting in favor of the defenders. And then, with a final, desperate push, the enemy broke, their forces retreating in disarray as the defenders let out a triumphant cheer. Lewis collapsed against the wall of the trench, his body trembling with exhaustion. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. The trench was littered with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. But they had won. They had held the line, and for now, at least, the war had been kept at bay. As the men began to regroup, Lewis allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had faced the darkness, had looked into the abyss, and had not flinched. He had fought with everything he had, and he had prevailed. And as he looked at the faces of his comrades, at the men who had fought and bled beside him, he felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. They had survived, but more than that, they had triumphed. They had stood together, had faced the horrors of war with faith and courage, and they had come out the other side. Lewis knew that there would be more battles to come, more challenges to face. But for now, they had won a small victory, and that was enough. As the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, Lewis whispered a silent prayer of thanks. The war was far from over, but he knew that they would continue to fight, to stand firm in the face of adversity, with the light of faith guiding them every step of the way. Part 5. A Testament of Faith. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood as Lewis and his men surveyed the aftermath of the battle. The enemy had been driven back, their forces shattered and retreating in disarray. But the cost of victory weighed heavily on the survivors. The trench, once a fragile line of defense, was now a graveyard, littered with the fallen bodies of those who had fought with all their might to protect what little ground they held. Lewis, exhausted and battle-worn, stood at the edge of the trench, his heart heavy with the loss of his comrades. The morning light revealed the devastation in stark detail. Craters from artillery shells pockmarked the ground, and the twisted remains of barbed wire hung like the tattered remnants of a nightmare. Yet, amidst the destruction, there was a sense of relief, a quiet recognition that they had survived the worst that the enemy could throw at them. The soldiers moved slowly, their movements stiff and mechanical, as they began the grim task of recovering the bodies of their fallen brothers. There was no ceremony, no words spoken, just a shared understanding of the gravity of their duty. Each man carried the weight of his own grief, the loss of friends and comrades a constant ache in their hearts. Lewis felt the burden of leadership more acutely than ever before. He had guided these men through the darkest moments of the war, had shared in their fears and their hopes, and now he was left to carry the memory of their sacrifice. He could feel the exhaustion deep in his bones, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue and settled in his very soul. Yet, he knew that he could not afford to falter. The war was not yet over, and there were still battles to be fought. As the sun continued its slow ascent, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Lewis turned his gaze toward the horizon. The sky was a canvas of pale blues and pinks, the promise of a new day just beginning to take shape. It was a stark contrast to the darkness that had engulfed them just hours before, and Lewis felt a flicker of hope stir within him. But it was not just the light of a new day that gave him hope. It was the knowledge that, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, there had been moments of grace, moments when the light of faith had guided them through the darkness. Lewis thought back to the vision he had seen, the figure of light that had appeared to him in the heat of battle. He knew that it had not been a mere figment of his imagination. It had been real as the ground beneath his feet, and it had saved his life, and the lives of those who had followed him. The memory of that vision was a source of strength for Lewis, a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle. There was a purpose to their fight, a reason for their suffering, and it was rooted in something far greater than themselves. Lewis felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, a calm that seemed out of place in the aftermath of such violence, but which he knew was a gift from the divine. He turned to his men, who were now gathered around him, their faces drawn and weary but their eyes filled with a quiet determination. They had been through hell together, had faced the very worst that war had to offer, and yet they had emerged on the other side, battered but unbroken. Lewis knew that they would carry the scars of this battle for the rest of their lives, but he also knew that they would carry with them the knowledge that they had fought with honor, with courage, and with faith. In that moment, as the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds and bathed the battlefield in a soft, golden light, Lewis raised his voice in a prayer of thanks. It was a prayer for the fallen, for those who had given their lives in the defense of their country. It was a prayer for the survivors, for those who would carry on the fight. And it was a prayer of gratitude, for the light that had guided them through the darkness and brought them safely to the dawn. All honor and glory to you, Lord, now and forever. Amen. As the words left his lips, Lewis felt a sense of completion, as if the prayer had sealed the chapter of his life that had been written in blood and sacrifice. The war was far from over, but Lewis knew that he had been changed by the experiences he had endured. He was no longer the young soldier who had left his home with dreams of glory and honor. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity, but who had also seen the best, and who had found his faith strengthened in the crucible of war. The sun continued its climb into the sky, its light casting long shadows over the battlefield, but also bringing with it the warmth of a new day. Lewis and his men turned away from the scene of devastation and began the slow, weary march back to their camp. They carried with them the memories of those they had lost, but they also carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something greater than themselves. As they walked, Lewis felt a sense of peace settle over him, a calm that he knew was a gift from the divine. He had fought the good fight, had kept the faith, and now he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The war would continue, but Lewis knew that he would not face it alone. He had his faith, his comrades, and the light that had guided him through the darkest of nights. And that, he knew, would be enough. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.